Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Great Leadership. My guest today is John Miles. He's the host of the Passion Struck podcast. He's also the author of a brand new book by the same name called Passion Struck. And I was very fortunate to be a guest on John's podcast a few months ago. And now he is a guest on this show to talk about his new book. John, thank you so much for joining me.
Hey, Jacob, it's great to see you again, and I'm so excited to be here for your community.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the conversation. So this is a pretty, I think, a timely book. Let me just read the subtitle of it so people can get a sense of what we're going to be talking about. 12 Powerful Principles to Unlock Your Purpose and Ignite Your Most Intentional Life. And the subject of purpose is very, very relevant, especially in the corporate world today. It keeps coming up time and time again. So we're going to be structuring the conversation in a few different ways. You have a really cool model that you have in the book, the 4 pillars of the Passion Struck model, which we'll dive into. We'll talk about some of the mindset shifts, some of the behavioral shifts, and then for the Leaders Toolkit section at the very end, we're going to talk about these 5 transition points that you outlined in the book and maybe what we need to be aware of and what we should do for each one of those 5 transition points. Before we get into that, though, why don't you give us a little bit of background information about you, how you got involved in all the stuff that you're doing, because from what I recall, you used to have a traditional 9 to 5 full-time job as a consultant. Now you're off on your own. How'd that happen?
Jacob, the first thing I want to correct is I'm not sure my job was ever a 9 to 5 job in the history
Yeah.
of the time I worked. Um, I ended up graduating from the Naval Academy. I had a great tenure in the service. I thought I was going to continue that service to the country by becoming an FBI agent. And then Congress couldn't get their act together and pass the budget. My class got recycled. And that took me on a reinvention I never thought was going to happen because I had no plan B. And I ended up being lucky to get hired by Booz Allen. And ironically, the first client I worked on was creating the National Infrastructure Protection Center of Excellence for the FBI, ironically. But I spent a number of years with Booz, and then I became a Big Four consultant at Anderson Consulting. And again, I thought that this was going to be my path to the future. I was on the cusp of becoming a partner. I was a practice leader, and unfortunately, I was a practice leader in Houston and saw the whole Enron debacle happen around me. And so
Mm.
I went from having a big book of business, a clear path to what I thought was going to be the future of my career, all evaporate within 2 to 3 weeks. And I again had to reinvent
Wow.
myself. And this time I decided to pivot into large corporations because I wanted more international experience. So I took a job with a large multinational company called Lendlease, which at the time was one of the top 10 Australian companies on the Australian Stock Exchange and became their chief information security officer at a time where I was one of the first in that role anywhere in the world. And from there, I got hired away to basically clean up the largest hacking event that any happened to any retailer to that point in time in history at Lowe's, and also clean up their infrastructure and operations. And I ended up culminating my time there by running all application development, all data
Wow.
operations, and then took a role with Dell as initially a divisional CIO for their consumer brand, and eventually became the CIO for all their uh, all their sales organizations, plus represented the services organization, HR, finance, etc. And at that point, I decided to do another pivot, and I ended up going into private equity, where I became a partner and also an operating executive, where I ended up leading 2 or 3 of the portfolio companies. So, kind of a pretty diverse business background. And along the way, I had always felt this calling that I was meant to do something different. And that culminated in me becoming an entrepreneur and starting this venture that I'm now doing called Passion Struck, as you mentioned at the beginning.
And how long have you been doing that?
I launched the company in the fall of 2000 and launched the podcast in February of 2021. So not that long, actually.
Wow, so the podcast is fairly new.
It is. It'll hit 3 years about the same time my book comes out.
Wow, congratulations. It's very exciting.
Yeah,
So
and I'm not sure about you. You've written more books than me, but I remember when I was talking to agents, they were asking me, how do you even know what in the book is going to resonate? And that was one of the reasons I started the podcast, because I needed a medium that I could judge the audience's reception to it, but also test out different concepts.
well, it's funny. I think a podcast is a great way to just learn. I mean, the reason I started my podcast was really to be able to get access to a lot of business leaders, professionals, authors, smart people to learn from them. And then a lot of the things that I would learn, I would share those insights in my book, in my speeches. I would look for trends. I would look for all, patterns that would come up. So it's been a very enormously useful tool for me. But I think anybody can not necessarily start a podcast, but it's really all about conversation. And I think that most people, especially in the kind of the traditional corporate world, they don't spend enough time talking to people outside of their team or department or zone. And so anybody can, mentally create their podcast, right? Where they view the conversations that they're having throughout the day as an inner podcast and just try to check in with different people in different teams and learn about different subjects. And it is such an enormous, I think, useful and valuable resource that more people should do it. So I kind of like that mental podcast metaphor. Hopefully, a lot of people will pick that up and try that. So you took a lot of the lessons that you learned from the hundreds of conversations that you've had at this point.
I actually took a lot of them from before I even started the podcast. But
Ah,
once I started it, I was able to infuse each one of the chapters that I wrote with interviews that I did on the podcast. And it was kind of ironic for me because I didn't intentionally set out to interview the people that I did about each of the chapters, but it just so happened that I had on, whether it was a psychologist or a behavior scientist, where it completely aligned that every single thing that I cover in the book is backed by science.
hmm. Yeah, I'm looking at your Apple page here. It looks like 402 published recorded episodes. So you've talked to a lot of people over the years. Like you said, you've had CEOs, you've had authors on there, really, really smart people. So to your point, a lot of the concepts in the book are backed up by science and research and data. I thought maybe we could start off with just kind of a high level overview, and you tell me if this is the right way to think about it. But I thought we could start with this model that you have in the book, the passion struck model that has these four pillars, and introduce what that model is, how those pillars work with each other, and then maybe we can dive a little bit deeper into each one of those.
That would be a great way to do it. So the book is really organized into the sections of mindset shifts, behavior shifts, what I call the psychology of progress or deliberate action, and then it's all surrounded by the fuel of intrinsic motivation. So the mindset
Hmm.
shifts you can think of as our why influencing how we approach challenges and opportunities. Our behavior shifts are really the what, and it's a direct reflection of our mindset dictating how we pursue our goals. And then the deliberate action is really the when and the where that we apply it. And as I mentioned, the intrinsic motivation then becomes the fuel that brings all of this into a continuous loop.
Okay, and so let's start off with um, the mindsets. So it seems like, actually, even before we get into that, so this model is really to be used for anybody, it seems like, who is trying to figure out maybe what they should be doing or how do you recommend people apply this model? I mean, if you have things figured out in your career, you know what you want to do, you're on that path. Is this model still relevant for you, or is it really just for people who are struggling, trying to figure out where they belong, where they fit in, what their purpose is, and where their careers should go?
That's a great question. And there are really four audiences for this. The first was for high achievers who maybe are plateauing or trying to figure out how they make that next jump, to give them tools and the toolkit to do so. Another major group was for new college graduates, people just entering the workforce, to kind of give them a map of how to create an intentional, purpose, passion struck life. Another
Okay.
group are people who feel stuck where they are and need to go from being stuck to passion struck. And then a fourth one that I wrote it for were athletes who might be at a level where they find themselves plateauing and they're looking for keys that can go help them go from being average at what they're doing to become great at it. So those are kind of the four groups that I had in mind.
I learned something really crazy today. 96% of the people who watch videos on this channel are not subscribed to the channel. Do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. It'll help the channel grow, and you'll also get notified when new videos just like this one on leadership are available. And now, let's get back to the content. Okay, and I would say most people probably fit into one of those categories. So the mindsets, we probably won't get into all the mindsets here, and maybe I'll ask you to pick, let's say, two or three that you love the most. But let me just read what some of the mindsets are. Mission Angler, which is muster the power to do something great. Brand Reinventor, never being afraid to reinvent yourself. Mosquito Auditor, which is avoid the most dangerous animal on the planet. Fear Confronter, realizing that you are your biggest competitor. Perspective Harnesser, zoom out and tap into its power. Action Creator, permit yourself to dream the dream. So when you think of all those mindsets, if let's say we were to pick two of them to start, which two mindsets do you think are most relevant for people that have corporate jobs? Or which ones are you most passionate about?
Okay, I'll start out with the mosquito auditor because I think this is a great one for someone who's in a corporate position. And the ironic thing,
Okay.
Jacob, is when I originally wrote the book, I wrote this for more of a business audience, and the publisher wanted to be tweaked so that it was more for the individual. So I can go either direction on these because I originally
Okay, okay.
wrote it through the lens of a business customer or a business reader. So I ended up coming up with this mosquito auditor principle. And when I write, I find my inspiration during times of mindfulness. And my way I like to do it the most is to somehow or another get out into nature. I happened to be on a walk this day and I was thinking about this chapter. As you mentioned, the book starts with the whole idea of becoming a mission angler, which is really life crafting the life that you want. It then goes into once you do that, you need to start reinventing yourself and that brand that you have. And then the third thing that we typically get impacted by is invisible influences. So, as I was thinking about these invisible influences, and Jonah Berger wrote a great book on this, um, I happened to be hearing this radio show, and the announcer was talking about the most dangerous animal on the planet. And he was asking the audience to give who they thought it was. And I was listening, and I was coming up with the same answers everyone else was. The dangerous animals they have in Australia are the great white shark. And it turns out I wasn't even remotely close, nor were any of the other listeners. It turns out that a mosquito is more deadly than all the sharks in the world will be over 100 years. I mean, it kills between 1 million to 2 million people every single year. It's just staggering the impact that these mosquitoes have. And yet,
Hmm.
most of the time, they're invisible. We might hear their buzzing, but it's not until we get bitten that we really take notice. And even then, we continue to allow them to be around us and we don't take precautions. And as I was thinking about this, the same thing goes with human mosquitoes that are in our lives, these invisible influences. And you could look at this as either people in your life, which I'll orient it towards, but they could be activities or other things that you're doing that are taking you farther and farther away from where you want to be. So I tried to make this a fun metaphor. So I came up with three types of mosquitoes to make this pretty easy for someone to diagnose them. The first one I call the bloodsucker. And so this is that boundary destroyer who wants every ounce of blood that they can take from you. The second one
Hmm.
I call the invisible suffocator. And these are the pessimist or the glass half full type of people who are in your life. It's like that uncle who we just got through Christmas, but you're having Christmas dinner with them. You tell them about this new amazing job opportunity you get, and he starts going into all the negatives about it and why it's going to be a negative instead of a positive in your life. And then the third, I call the pitas, which are really those pieces of work or pain in the asses that infiltrate our lives and we just seem to allow in and can't permanently swat them out. So those are the three main mosquito types that I talk about. And the way I think you can apply this is to start thinking about your professional career. I mean, it can go deeper than that into your personal career, but let's just think about your professional career and imagine that you're shooting archery and you've got that target in front of you. I would just simply start going into that and start going through the first three concentric circles of that target, put five people who influence you on a daily basis into each grouping, and then start going through and applying this mosquito audit to them and determine
Hmm.
if any of those descriptions. And I'm guaranteeing you they likely will. So then it becomes once you have identified them, it gives you a great opportunity because now that you recognize that invisible influence in your life, you can do something about it.
Hmm. Yeah, I like that. So I think the second two are more self-explanatory. That right there was I don't even remember the names of them. I remember the bloodsucker was the first one, which is what I wanted to ask you to get a little bit deeper on. The third one was just kind of a general pain. And what was the second type of mosquito again?
The invisible suffocator.
Ah, yes, the invisible suffocator. um, Tell me a little bit about the bloodsucker because I have a feeling a lot of people might say, "Oh, that's my manager, that's my leader," or maybe even the suffocator. Right? I imagine the micromanager that's coming to you, that's constantly, "What's going on with this? What's going?" on? And you just feel so overwhelmed and flustered. And I suppose maybe even sometimes I could be that mosquito every now and then with my team. But I'm really interested in the bloodsucker. Is this the one that's constantly just trying to take from you without giving, without reciprocating value or sharing, or helping you in any way? They're just trying to benefit themselves nonstop.
Yeah, I mean, I think a great way to represent this is a peer in your circle who you constantly are helping out and they're taking everything from you that they possibly can, propelling themselves forward, but give nothing back in return. And
Ah,
ultimately, what they're looking to try to do is to propel themselves over you when that next job opportunity comes. I mean, that's just one example,
mm,
but it
yeah,
could be it could be a customer that you're working with who, although you've got tons of other customers that you're working with, feels that they're entitled to be the one who gets all the attention, gets to extract everything that they feel that they deserve from you, but isn't reciprocating back in the same way your other customers might.
yeah. It's funny. We have in our circle of friends, and we moved to Los Angeles a few years ago. So but from here originally, and we have I'd say pretty good circle of friends here. And the circle of friends keeps getting bigger as new people get introduced. And there have been several times where we would get together with the circle of friends, and there's new people who get brought in, and they always say, "Oh, do you know so and so?" And I would say, "Yeah, yeah, I know so and so." And they're like, "Oh man, that person," and they never have anything nice to say about this person. And it's precisely because a lot of people view this person as somebody who only wants to know you or be your friend or be in your circle if they can benefit from you. And as soon as they realize they can't benefit from you, this person has a reputation of kind of abandoning you and just leaving you and not wanting to be your friend and not wanting to socialize or engage with you. And so I think a lot of people know who this person is, right? In your company, I'm sure if a lot of employees went and asked their peers, like, who is the bloodsucker at our company? A lot of people would be like, oh, it's Jim in accounting, or it's you know Sally in operations. Like people know who that bloodsucker is pretty well. Uh, when you get this type of a mosquito in your life, or any mosquito, for example, in your life, and you know that that person is there, do you have any advice on recourse for what to do? Because in a corporate environment, you're not gonna you're not gonna off your boss. Do you confront them? Do you talk to them about it? Do you try to switch teams? What do you do if you're stuck with one of those types of mosquitoes as a leader?
In this particular example of the boundary destroyer, since you know they're manipulative and you know that they're likely going to go away when you don't give them what they want, um, part of the way that you can handle that situation is to do just that, is to realize what they're after and to slowly but surely extract yourself from being that person who keeps giving them what they want. Because as you explained, the more you do that and the more that they're not getting something from you, they will slowly back away and eventually start trying to take it from someone else who they think they can
Mm,
manipulate. But all three of them, it really comes down to you setting personal boundaries. And it just
yeah.
becomes, depending on who the relationship with, how subtly or how forcefully that you are able to set those boundaries. The most important thing that I think people get wrong is they might start setting the boundaries, but then they're not consistent with it. And with that lack of consistency, it opens up the door for the influences to just keep coming back. And it actually can make it even worse than it was the first time. So you've got to recognize it. You've got to figure out what approach and boundary setting technique you want to use. And then you've got to be very consistent at applying it.
Okay. Let's go over maybe one more mindset before we talk about some of the behavior shifts.
Yeah, one that I'd probably like to touch on, and it maybe isn't even one that people think should be top of mind, but I would say that it's the perspective harnesser. And the
Mm,
reason I think this is so important is in Western society specifically, which is deeply rooted in Greek philosophy, we experience linear thinking. So we tend to think of things, especially at work, as either I or or. And in this chapter, I really advocate that we need to use both and thinking so that we're looking at things that with duality instead of this linear way that we tend to approach things. And so, I mean, examples of this would be balancing hard work with rest, merging
okay.
self-discipline with self-compassion, finding solitude and balancing that with time that you have with community. So you're getting both the relationship build, but you're having the solitude that you need to be innovative and creative. In a health context, it would be integrating your mind and body. So oftentimes, though, we don't see things that way. And this was a chapter that I utilized a good friend of mine, Chris Cassidy, who some of the listeners may actually know who he is, because he is a former uh, Navy SEAL turned chief astronaut of NASA. And I remember
Oh,
talking to Chris about this perspective harnessing and how he used it throughout his career. And it's interesting because when you talk to most astronauts, they forever change their perspectives once they go up in space. And I remember talking to him about it, and he was up there and he told me the story that he was flying over New York and he's looking down and that he's just imagining someone in their daily commute, given the time that they were going over. And he's just sitting there picturing that person in the car is probably running late. They're probably stuck in traffic. They're probably wanting to flick someone off. And he just looked at it and saw how insignificant that was in the big scheme of things. And it reshaped the way that he approached situations. Another thing
yeah.
he talks about is the power of cognitive restructuring. And as he was going through BUDS, uh, basic underwater demolition training, for those who aren't familiar with it, but he became the class honor man and he was telling me that most of the people who quit buds don't do it during the activities. They do it in anticipation of the hardships that are going to come. And he told me this one story that he was in charge of his boat crew, and right before Hell Night or Hell Week, they were asked to go in and clean their instructors' offices. And they went in, and this is something that would have probably taken them half an hour, 45 minutes to do, but they were given 4 hours to do it. And on the desk right there was this manual that said Hell Week training schedule. And Chris remembered seeing it and just thinking, there's got to be something to this, to it being there. And the best thing to do is to ignore it. But a couple of the people thought differently and decided that they had enough time that they could go and make copies of the entire manual, stayed up all night reviewing it so that they would understand what was going to happen. And then the next day, because they looked at all the things that they were going to be required to do over the next week and what seemed to be impossible to them, they ended up quitting before Hell Week even began. And he
Wow.
said that's something that was so common. But what he learned was that you could restructure trying times like a rubber band, that they're elastic, that there's a beginning and an end. And the most important thing is that any obstacles we face in our life, you can look at them through the perspective that trying times end. And so you can approach them with that both and thinking, and how you're applying
Hmm.
yourself to them. So I think this is a really good one for people to understand.
If you enjoy getting leadership and career advice and trying to figure out how to future proof your organization, you are not going to want to miss heading over and subscribing to my Substack, which you can do by going to greatleadership.substack.com. We have a community there of tens of thousands of people from around the world, and it's where I share my latest thinking, my best ideas, exclusive interviews with CEOs, in-depth articles and insights that I share, and leadership hacks from some of the world's top leaders and best-selling authors. So if you want to really step up your leadership game, excel in your career, head over to greatleadership.substack.com. You are not going to want to miss this opportunity. Focusing on what's worth, I suppose, getting upset about and what's not, what matters and what doesn't. I try to do this with my daughter. Sometimes she's 7 years old, and kids oftentimes will get upset about things which are not really a big deal, but to them are a big deal. We ran out of spicy chips, or I don't know, something completely ridiculous, or her brother got maybe something that she didn't. He got a little bit of more spicy chips than she did. And even though oftentimes she would end up having like a fantastic day, we would go to the park, she would see her friends, like everything would be amazing. If one little thing doesn't go her way at the very end, sometimes that can kind of derail everything. And so one of the things that I'm constantly trying to work on with her is emotional intelligence, to understand what is significant and what's not. Like, is it really a big deal that we ran out of spicy chips and we can go to the store to buy more? Like, is that worth getting upset about? As opposed to, did you get in a fight with your friend? Or are you hurt? Or somebody that you know hurt? And so she's constantly trying to reframe, and I'm constantly asking her, Naomi, is this really worth getting upset about? And I can see her oftentimes trying to take that different perspective and change her tone and her tune. Similarly, I had a personal experience with this. This was fairly recently, actually. One of my good friends, all of a sudden I noticed that he stops calling and stops texting, and he's upset at me for something, and I couldn't figure out what it was for. And he didn't really want to talk about it. And then fairly recently we go out, we get together, and he tells me what he's upset over. And it was totally crazy to me. Like, I had no idea that this would make him upset. And I realized I had a choice at that point too. And I could have sat there and tried to defend and tried to, no, that's, and get into this whole argument and kind of, make it confrontational. Or, as my wife says, she always says, you can be right or you can be loving. And so in that moment, I didn't really care what he was upset about. It was the fact that somebody was upset. And that because this is somebody that I care about and my family cares about, I just said, we're sorry we did that. We talked about it a little bit more. But I think it's again that example of like, if this is somebody that I didn't really care about, if it's somebody that I didn't really, want to maintain friends with, maybe I would have taken a different tone. But I think that perspective really matters. Now everything's great again, right? Now everything's back to normal. We had lunch, we went over everything, and now everything is just kind of gone. Whereas opposed to me taking a different path, it could have been drawn out for days or weeks or months, and we could have hated each other, and it could have just been this whole thing. I think inside of organizations, it's very similar, right? With our leaders, with our employees, we can easily hold grudges. We can easily get defensive. We can get upset. And I think it is important to remember, to your point, to take that perspective and realize, is something really worth getting upset about? Did the person really mean to do that to you? Are they really trying to hurt you or bring you down? Or maybe it was just a misunderstanding. So I actually love that one. I think it's very, very applicable, especially to the business world.
Yeah, let me just give two more examples that I think people can think out, because both and thinking is really paradoxical thinking. So just think about the paradox of tolerance. Absolute tolerance can destroy tolerance. So a society that tolerates everything, including intolerance, can become intolerant. So true tolerance requires limits to preserve things that are so important, like diversity and freedom. I think another one is the failure paradox. Failure is a valuable teacher. Each failure provides, as you know, insights and learning opportunities. And you can just look at James Dyson's numerous failed prototypes before his
Mm-hmm.
successful vacuum cleaner. And there are other ones like subjectivity paradox and confirmation bias paradox. But it's important to recognize these things because they do really impact how you're thinking and that emotional intelligence that you were talking about with your daughter that you end up showing.
Yeah. Hmm. Let's talk about two of the behavior shifts before we get into the transition points. So we have anxiety optimizer, originality embracer, boundary magnifier, outward inspire, gardener a leader, conscious engager. So similar with the mindsets, if we had to pick two to dive deep into, which would those two be for you?
So these behavior shifts, really all of them apply. But I think knowing your audience, a couple that will help them out are, let's dive into first the anxiety optimizer. And in this chapter, I really do a deep dive on my friend Mark Devine, who's a former Navy SEAL like Chris, but he now is a best-selling author and has his own bunch of self-improvement brands. But when Mark had decided to go to become a SEAL, he also, as he was going through BUDS, learned that in order to get through this, he was going to have to find to use every ounce of physical, mental, and emotional strength he had. And so he knew it was paramount that he took all this anxiety that is kind of like a flame. It can either be this negative undertone in your life, or you can use it to become your most positive ally. So
Mm-hmm.
the way to think about this is imagining yourself on a tightrope, and on one side is overwhelming fear, and on the other side is complacent indifference. And if you think about this from a SEAL perspective, it could be on the one side, you're so scared and nervous about having to go into the cold water that you just psych yourself out of it. The other side of it is you're so calm that you're not allowing yourself to realize how rough it might be. But what you really want to do is find that perfect equilibrium between the two of them, which is really where you reach peak performance. And um, this science is actually backed by a ton of research. McKinsey did a 10-year study where they actually examined executives who were able to find this zone of optimal anxiety, and they performed 400% higher than their peer groups. And another
Wow.
interesting thing was they had significantly better work life balance because they were able to do in 2 hours what the majority of people were doing in 8. And
Hmm.
so that's what this whole chapter is about, the really the balance between stress and calm and how to use that to ignite your performance.
Yeah, I've talked to a couple people on this podcast, a couple psychologists and researchers who all say that stress inherently and anxiety is not bad. Some of it is actually very useful for you. I mean, obviously, you need to figure out how to maintain it. You want to make sure it doesn't get to high levels that can kind of disrupt your life. But a little bit of anxiety and a little bit of stress can actually do a lot of wonders for you. So, as far as the behavior shift here, is this really just about embracing and understanding that some anxiety is good and that you shouldn't be constantly trying to eliminate and remove all of it from your life?
Well, I think that's part of it, but it's also understanding how you put yourself into this state of optimum
Ah,
performance.
okay.
Because the more you recognize how to get there, the more it becomes something that you can train yourself to get into that zone and to use it more regularly to upskill and enhance your performance. So, and I think the important thing for people to understand is that this is a muscle, or it's like a muscle that gets better with practice. And the analogy I like to give people is that it's learning how to be on the edge without going off the edge. A great way to think about this
Hmm.
would be Jimmy Johnson, the race car driver, who really perfected this. Because if you go too slow in a race car, you're likely going to crash out because the drivers behind you are anticipating you to be more aggressive. But if you're overly aggressive, you're going to be like Will Ferrell and you're going to wreck as well. So the idea is to figure out where you treat it as if you're hitting a baseball bat or you're a
Yeah.
batter in the box and that ball's coming at you and you're seeing it so clearly that everything else slows down. And it's really about how do you make time malleable so that you use it the most wisely you can. And so, some of the things I recommend people who are experiencing it is you've got to have awareness. So one of the things is if anxiety is hitting you, you need to catch it before you start spiraling because awareness is half the battle won. So notice when unease creeps in, that prickly feeling saying things are about ready to get really hairy. That's your
Yeah.
cue. And then dial back with some type of breath control. The easiest one to use would be box breathing. Um, that would be the simplest one to implement. But generally, breath control is something that I learned when I was in the military. That anytime I have to give a big presentation, go into a heated meeting, etc., I use it to calm my system down. And then the last thing I would tell people to do is to remember to pace, don't race. Keep tasks challenging yet attainable. And remember Goldilocks, not too hard nor too easy, just right.
Got it. All right, let's do one more behavior shift before we get into these five transition points. What behavior shift you want to get into next?
Well, one that I would love to talk about, given that you're talking to leaders, is the Gardner leader. Because I am someone who has absolutely loved leadership from as long as I can remember. Since I was a small boy, my dream was always to become a leader, and I have pursued it my entire life, which is what took me to the Naval Academy and beyond. And I would say that the vast majority of my career, I implemented servant leadership, and it served
Okay.
me very well until it started not to. And this is when I started to
Hmm.
see that perhaps a new approach is needed today because we're living in a time now where work is becoming faster paced. People are working outside of the office. You've got outsourcing that more and more companies are doing. And so it, to me, invokes a new type of leadership. So a Gardner leader you can think of as someone who intentionally nurtures their team growth, akin to how a gardener carefully tends to each plant in their garden. And it involves a deep understanding of each individual's unique talents and potential, but it's coupled with providing them the right environment and resources for them to thrive, plus giving them consistent feedback as well as giving them praise and rewards for when they're doing things that the gardener wants to see flourish. So, a core component, Jacob, of this approach is what I call the need to be eyes on and hands off. So, you were talking before about micromanaging, and this is where the leader is actually informed without micromanaging, which is so critical,
Mm,
I think, if you want to have an innovative driven workplace, because it allows team members the autonomy to experiment. It allows them to take risks and develop creative solutions while still having the guidance and support of their leader. And I think a great example of this would be one of the people I feature in this chapter is General Stan McChrystal. So if you imagine that he is in Afghanistan and he's the four-star in charge of all the forces there, and he's got a critical mission that he's deploying some Green Berets on, he needs to be hands on he needs to be eyes on from the standpoint of ensuring that they understand the criticality of the mission that they're going on, that he's prepared them and trained them to have the right acumen to do it, and that he has done everything he can to put them in the best position to be successful. But then he needs to be hands off, because if they're operating in a distant mountainside and he's back there at Bangor Air Force Base, or there's no way that he can possibly understand what's going on in that situational awareness, and he can't micromanage the action that they're going to take, or
yeah.
they could be fatal. Because just think about the feedback loop you'd have to have with him trying to ascertain what the enemy is doing and then give those people in real time actions to carry out. It just wouldn't work. I think the same thing needs to be adopted today in workplaces.
Makes sense. Um, so I'm actually curious. The main difference between the gardener leader and the servant leader, because you mentioned you believed in and practiced servant leadership until it didn't go your way. Uh, are you briefly able to share what that story was and what the main difference is between the servant leader and the gardener leader?
Yeah, I think that there are a number of different differences. So, gardener leadership concentrates on cultivating growth, potential, and capabilities in team members, like I talked about. And the emphasis here is on providing resources, environment, and guidance for long term growth and development. When I think of servant leadership, I think of it more as real time needs and concerns. It still is prioritizing the needs of the team, ensuring their well being, but I think of it more as short term focused rather than long term focus. I also think that there's a difference in how each one approaches empowerment. So the gardener leader empowers their team by giving them autonomy, encouraging them to take ownership of their work. And in servant leadership, empowerment comes through support and service. The leader tends to be more hands on in addressing their needs, often involving direct involvement. And so those are a couple things. I mean,
Hmm.
another one you could look at is leadership drive and ambition. A gardener leader is characterized by a blend that I call ambitious, humility, and ambition, balancing personal ego with the drive to achieve broader organizational goals, whereas the servant leader emphasizes humility and a service oriented mindset, sometimes at the expense of assertive ambition or organizational goal setting. So, those are just a few of the subtleties between the two.
Okay. Well, for people who want to learn more, they're going to have to grab a copy of the book. But for now, why don't we transition to these 5 transition points? This is the segment of the show we call the Leader's Toolkit. So, talk a little bit about what these 5 transition points are. Why is it important to be able to know and even identify what these transition points are? And what do you do when you identify them? My conversation with John Miles continues as he talks about the 5 transition points that people go through to become passion struck. So if you want to learn what those 5 transition points are and how you can actually go through those transition points, then make sure to subscribe to Great Leadership Plus on Apple Podcasts. And when you subscribe, you'll get access to a bonus episode every single week, as well as ad-free listening. If you want to grab a copy of my new book, you can head to leadwithvulnerability.com. And of course, I always invite you to join our community. It's greatleadership.substack.com. That is a link to the free version where you can get notified when new podcasts are up. You can get access to the transcripts, fun stuff like that. We also have a paid version, which is that same URL, greatleadership.substack.com/GL podcasts. It's actually a special discount, 20% off just for podcast listeners. And that is where you get access to bonus videos that I create every week called The 5-Minute Leader, where I share a leadership tip and a strategy that I got from a CEO. It's also where I write exclusive weekly articles just for you around a particular leadership topic where you get an insight, a strategy, something that you can apply to become a better leader. So I invite you to join the community over there. I hope you enjoyed this episode. And if you found this to be an enjoyable episode, please send it to somebody who you would like to see become a better leader. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.